Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm taking a look at the 2026 Senate elections map, and amid everything going on right now with the economy and with the tariffs and such, I thought it'd be fun to do a hypothetical scenario for 2026 where this Senate map happens where President Trump's approval rating at the time is at 45%. And I got this idea when looking at President Trump's latest approval ratings, where when you look at it right now, President Trump's current approval numbers are sitting at 47.6% as of the time I'm recording this video. Disapproval is sitting at 49.8%. And when you look back at President Trump's approval rating in his first term, he started off in around early January, sitting around about 43% or so favorable, 49% unfavorable. By the time the November elections in 2018 rolled around, to try and get the exact date here, his approval rating around November 2nd or so was about 44.1%, disapproved about 42.7%. This time around, it seems that Trump's support is still higher on both the approval and disapproval rating, but if the economy does do poorly over the next few weeks and months, it is possible Trump's approval rating could continue to fall. So for this video, I'm going under this scenario where President Trump's approval rating is going to sit around 45%. And his disapproval rating is probably going to be somewhere, if it's at 49.8% now, it's probably going to be somewhere around like 52 to 52.5% disapproval. So what would the 2026 Senate map look like? Well, without any of these races factored in, there's 35 seats that are up in 2026. Democrats start off with 34 Senate seats. Republicans start out with 31. And this Senate map that's up in 2026, I'll pull up the Senate map, was last up in 2020. And there are a number of seats that we already know how they are going to go, in all likelihood, regardless, honestly, of how President Trump's approval rating is doing. For instance, states like Massachusetts, which elected the Democratic candidate Ed Markey, the senator, by over 30 points, we know will stay Democrat, as will Rhode Island, and Oregon on the Democratic side with Jeff Merkley, in all likelihood. So we're going to go through the Democratic states that we know are going to remain Democratic. Oregon, Illinois, Delaware, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Rhode Island's supposed to be safe. Massachusetts, we all know for sure are going to be Democratic 100% at the end of the day. There are also some Republican Senate seats that we know for sure are going to be solid Republican, all things are said and done. Again, pretty much regardless of President Trump's job approval rating. These are places like Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. All of those we know are going to be safe, pretty much guaranteed, no matter what. Even if President Trump is having a really poor night, we know for pretty much for certain that they're going to be red no matter what. Nebraska is the only maybe interesting one. Actually, Mississippi I'll come back to as well. Nebraska could maybe be interesting depending on the fact that Dan Osborne, the independent candidate, may be running for that race. He's made an exploratory committee, so maybe that could potentially change some things. The race may get more competitive with him, but I still don't think it's going to be that competitive of a race compared to what 2024 was, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Even still, there's about 41 Republicans starting off as safe Republican for sure, 39 Democrats starting out as safe Democrat. Now in this map, where Trump is at a 45% disapproval rating, we're looking at the areas that are going to be likely for both parties and right on the edge between being likely and safe. So looking at the 2020 map, Colorado went for John Hickenlooper by 9.3%. And this is one where if Trump is doing this poorly, I believe there was a Senate race in 22, it went for 14.6% for Michael Bennet. This time around, if President Trump's approval rating is sitting around 45% or so, I think we could conceivably see Colorado being a safe Democrat. I am leaving it as a likely Democrat right now, around that 14.5% number that Michael Bennet got, but I am leaving the door open to it being a safe Republican state. New Mexico is another similar story where in 2020 it voted for Ben Ray Lujan, the Democrat, by 6.1%. In 2024, the Senate race that was up here won for Martin Heinrich by 10.1%. I don't think even with Trump's approval rating being at 45%, it would go safe Democrat, but I think a 14-point win at likely Democrat is probably the ceiling of what it could go, but I do think it would be likely Democrat. As for some of the Republicans, actually, no, we have a few more Democratic ones we're going to get to first. We have the state of New Jersey. New Jersey shocked a lot of people, including myself, in 2024, where it elected Kamala Harris by only about 6 points or so. Kim and the Senator Andy Kim won by 9.6% against his Republican opponent in 2024. It could be possible that it could go safe Democrat again, but I think even with Cory Booker at the top of the ticket, I think New Jersey starts out at likely Democrat for 2026, even with Trump's approval ratings being around 45% if they were. I do still think it would start out as likely Democrat. And lastly, the state of Virginia. Virginia, we just saw in 2024 go for Tim Kaine by 8.9%. So Mark Warner would have to make up another about like 5 or another 7 points or so to get it over to save Democrat. And I don't think it would do that. Even with Trump's approval rating doing bad, I think Virginia would still be likely Democrat. So this puts the Democrats up to 43 Senate seats, Republicans at 41, and the Democrats really haven't had to lift a finger at this point on the map yet. However, a lot of the remaining states I still think would go for the Republicans, even with President Trump's approval ratings being at 45% or maybe even a little bit lower. For starters, the state of Kansas. Kansas in 2022 elected the Republican by 23 points in the safe column. But in 2020, the Republican Marshall won 11.4% in the likely column. So there is a scenario where it could potentially become a likely Republican state in the right situation for the Democrats, but I do still think Kansas would very narrowly hold on and be a safe Republican state. Mississippi's in a very similar boat. In 2020, Cindy Hyde-Smith only won by 10 points against Mike Espy, but in 2024, it went 25.6% for Roger Wicker in Mississippi. So the question will be, has Hyde-Smith's approval numbers improved from 2020? If not, it could be another likely Republican win, but I think it would still probably go safe Republican in very red Mississippi. But again, that could be one to keep an eye out for. The state of South Carolina, this is going to be Lindsey Graham's Senate seat. In 2022, Tim Scott got reelected with 26 points almost. In 2020, Lindsey Graham only won it by 10.3%. This is another one where I'm kind of on the edge between making it a safe Republican state or likely Republican state. Lindsey Graham already has the endorsement of Donald Trump, but he's not well liked by a lot of the Republican Party. I am going on the side with the benefit of the doubt that South Carolina would still be safe Republican, but that's certainly one I could see becoming maybe likely Republican. And now we have the state of Florida. Florida is a state we just saw at the Senate level in 2024 elect Rick Scott by 12.8% at the Senate level. Back in 2020, in 2022, with Marco Rubio, he won it by 16.4%. That was a safe Republican margin. Now it's going to be Ashley Moody. Florida is trending more and more to the Republican side every single time, so I very well easily could put this as safe Republican. I am going to put it as likely Republican right now, though, as the most recent precedent in Florida has been a likely Republican win, and I think with Trump's approval ratings being at 45%, that is certainly possible to happening. Now we're going to go to the state of Alaska. Alaska is one I feel like doesn't really get talked about too much at the Senate level, but let's go to 2020, where it elected Dan Sullivan, the Republican, by only 12.7%, a likely Republican margin. 2022, it elected Lisa Murkowski against her Republican opponent by a likely Republican margin as well. So they were trying to primary challenge Murkowski out of the seat, but she was still able to win in a likely Republican margin. So with Trump's approval ratings being around 45%, I actually think Alaska would once again be a likely Republican state. Alaska is not really the safe Republican state that I thought it was for a while. It's actually more in the likely Republican rating in a lot of rankings and kind of goes underrated for being so. This puts our Republicans at 46, Democrats are at 43. Now we're getting into some states that I think could potentially be competitive, but also I'm not really too sure. And I'm going to do here first the state of Texas. So Texas in 2020 voted for John Cornyn by 9.6% against MJ Hagar, the Democratic candidate. In 2024, we just saw Ted Cruz get reelected by a likely Republican margin by 8.5%. The reason I'm a little skeptical was back in 2018 when Cruz was on the ballot, it was a 2.6% win for Cruz over Beto O'Rourke. Now, the Democrats here had an amazing night, but the approval ratings between Trump in the first term at around 43% and what it would be in this video at 45%, I think we could see a situation where Texas would not be 8.5 points, but it could maybe slip into being slightly competitive. I do still think the margin of victory with Trump's approval ratings at 45% would have Texas as likely Republican, but getting closer to the lean margin I think is certainly possible. The state of Montana, we did just see Montana elect Tim Sheehy, the Republican, by 7.1% against John Tester, the Democratic incumbent. That was a 7-point win. In 2020, we saw Steve Daines win against Steve Bullock, the former Democrat in Montana, by about 10 points. So both elections, both against very strong Democratic candidates, were under 15 points in the state of Montana. I don't know if the Democrats are going to run a strong candidate in Montana this time around, but I do think with Trump's approval ratings being at 45%, there's at least a chance Montana could end up being likely Republican yet again. Nebraska, this one I think is pretty simple. This one is all about Dan Osborne. Because in 2020, Nebraska was a safe Republican state, but in 2024, it ended up being a likely Republican state with Deb Fischer going up against Dan Osborne, only 6.7%. Now, Pete Ricketts did win by 25.2%, but if Trump's approval ratings are at 45% and the economy was still not doing too well, I could see Nebraska slipping down into likely Republican yet again, and maybe even getting down to lean Republican if things were going really bad for the Republicans and really good for Dan Osborne, but I think that's certainly a possibility. So this puts the Republicans at 49, Democrats are at 43. The chances of the Republicans not having the Senate in 2026, even with President Trump's approval ratings going down, is still pretty tough because the map does favor the Republicans in a lot of situations with the prior elections, and this map does favor the Republicans quite a bit with the seats that are up. But there are a few seats that I still think could go to the Democrats, one being Minnesota. Minnesota in 2024 elected Amy Klobuchar by 15.7%. In 2020, we'll pull it up here, it was Tina Smith, the Democrat. She won it by 5.2%, a likely Democratic win. This race is going to be open now, but the track record for Minnesota has been somewhere between likely and safe, very barely. I think Minnesota starts as likely Democrat with Trump's approvals around 45%. It depends who the Republicans put up, because if they put up the same candidate as they did in 2024, it'll probably be a safe Democratic win, but I think a likely Democratic win to start out for Minnesota for now. This puts the Democrats at 44. Republicans are at 49. Now we have the state of Iowa. Iowa was very close, actually, in 2020 with Joni Ernst. It was a 6.5% win for Ernst over Greenfield, and I don't know who the Democrats are going to put up in Iowa in 2026, but there is the potential of at very least a likely Republican race yet again, as it was very close in 2020 and 2022. Chuck Grassley, the long-term incumbent, only won by 12.2%. So if Trump's approval ratings are down again, where he's at around 45%, at very least, I think Iowa would start out as likely Republican and not safe Republican, and that could be one that potentially Democrats try and pull a sneaky capitalization on and maybe make a potential target. I don't think it would go blue. I think the Republicans would still have the advantage there, but I think it's one the Democrats would probably under the radar try and target. This puts the Republicans at 50, Democrats 44. In the state of Ohio, I don't really see Ohio, no matter what, going to the Democrats, in all honesty. The only way I could see it maybe is if Sherrod Brown runs for this seat again. But that remains to be seen if he will. He hasn't really given any hint or indication if he is going to run for that seat in 2026. But if he does, this is one I certainly could see getting much closer. Moreno beat Brown by 3.6% on the 2024 ballot. If Trump's approval ratings were doing poorly, then I couldn't even make the argument for Ohio being lean Republican to maybe even tilt Republican if Brown does enough. But I don't think he's going to run as of now. So I think Ohio starts out as likely Republican at this time. We saw Vance win it against Tim Ryan by about 6.1%. So the recent elections for the Senate in Ohio has actually been very close. I think it would still start out, though, as likely Republican, unless Sherrod Brown runs for the seat. Then that, combined with Trump's approval ratings, I think could push it under 5% Republican and make it a really competitive race. This puts the Republicans at 51, Democrats at 44. Now we're into the 5 seats that I really see as the battleground Senate seats in the 2026 map. Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, New Hampshire, and Maine. And this is where things get really interesting. Because with Susan Collins in Maine, Trump being unpopular, this may be the one Republican senator in Susan Collins where that really doesn't matter, because Susan Collins and Trump are not exactly on the same on a lot of issues and same eye to eye. I know Susan Collins and Trump have disagreed a ton, and that's made Trump very annoyed with Susan Collins at time. But that may actually be in this scenario what saved Susan Collins' job. She won against Sarah Gideon by 8.6% in 2020 in an election that ended up going well for Joe Biden, when many people, including myself, thought this could be it for Susan Collins. Maybe she would lose this election. The Democrats have yet to put up a really strong challenger in the state of Maine to go up against Susan Collins, and her breaking with President Trump a lot may actually give her enough of a pull here where she could still win the Maine Senate race in 2026, even with Trump's approval ratings being down to like 45%. But I will say this, I do think it goes under 5 points just by a little bit, and I think it's something like 4.8%, 4.9% on the first ballot of ranked choice voting where she's able to win. I think something where she gets like 50.2% and the Democrat, like without a third party candidate, gets like 46.5 or 47% or something in that nature, I think is possible for Susan Collins. But for the state of New Hampshire, they already have, I just did a video that just came out before I recorded this one. Chris Pappas, the congressman from New Hampshire, is running for the New Hampshire Senate race. So in my opinion, the New Hampshire Democrats have already done a good job at fielding their top potential recruit for the Senate race to replace Jeanne Shaheen. The Democrats needed a formidable Democratic candidate to run for this race, and I think they have it. The question is still, does Chris Sununu run for the Senate race? And Chris Sununu, when he's governor, he's very smart and very strategic with what he decides to do and what he decides to say. If President Trump's approval ratings are low, then he may see it as, maybe this isn't the election for me to run in because he may not win, and I don't think Sununu wants to run if he thinks he won't win. If the country is doing well enough for Sununu to run and he thinks he will win, he probably will. But if the country and the polls are doing bad enough for Trump, maybe Sununu decides to stay out of the race. And then we have Chris Pappas versus Scott Brown, or Chris Pappas versus another Republican. And then you look at the election history of New Hampshire, where 2020 Jeanne Shaheen won it by just over 15%, so a safe Democratic margin just over. In 2022, we saw Maggie Hassan win it by 9.1%, a likely Democratic win. So I think in this scenario, where for 2026, if Trump's approval numbers around 45% are a little low, Sununu decides to stay out of the race. It's Chris Pappas versus Scott Brown, or Chris Pappas versus someone else. And I think this is a way we could see Chris Pappas win it by over 5 points, under 15 points in a likely Democratic margin. I certainly think this is possible for 2026 in that scenario. This puts the Democrats at 45, Republicans 52, 3 Senate seats remaining, 1 in Michigan. Michigan, this is a really, really close one. This is going to be to replace the retiring Senator Gary Peters. Michigan is one of the closest states at the presidential level there is. The Senate level was just as tight in 2024, voting for Lisa Slotkin by 0.34%. The one saving grace is the Democrats seem to do really well in Michigan in off-presidential year elections recently. In 2022, there was no Senate map, but the governor's race in 2022 went for Gretchen Whitmer by about 10.5%, so that maybe could be a potential strength for the Democrats there. In 2020, Gary Peters won it by 1.7%, but I think the Senate race is going to be close in Michigan. And I think there's a possibility that if Trump's approval numbers are low at 45%, maybe we see Michigan go into likely Democrat, but I would still start Michigan out as a lean Democrat in this scenario, where I think it's going to be a tight race no matter what. Mike Rogers is running again. I think guarantees the Republicans a certain floor in the race of around like 45 to 46% of the vote, but the Democrat being able to capitalize on Trump's low approval numbers and getting a majority of the vote would be where the Democrats end up winning by about 4.5 points or so in that race. So this puts the Democrats at 46. 2 other remaining battleground states, one they're defending in Georgia, one potential pickup opportunity in North Carolina. For Georgia, I think a lot could be applied to what I just said about Chris Sununu in New Hampshire with Governor Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp, I will stand by the fact I think he's the only Republican that pretty much guarantees the Senate seat will go red in 2026. If Brian Kemp decides not to run for this race, I think it's more likely than not the Senate race stays for Jon Ossoff. And I think in this scenario where Trump's approval numbers are low, maybe Kemp sees an opening for 2028 and running for president, and maybe he thinks Vance is vulnerable or something, and then Kemp decides to run for that and not run for the Senate in Georgia. Then we look at the Senate races where in 2020, Ossoff won against Perdue by 1.2%, Warnock won by 2.1%, and then 2022, Warnock won re-election by 2.8%. In this scenario, I'm going to have Kemp staying out of the race. Trump's approval is at 45%. Ossoff is able to win re-election in a lean Democratic margin. I don't think in any scenario Ossoff is winning re-election by more than 5 points for the margin of victory, but I do think at very least it is possible he could win re-election, especially if Kemp is not his opponent. Lastly, this leads to North Carolina. North Carolina is one of the most fascinating races in the 2026 Senate map for me because it's all about the potential matchup of Roy Cooper versus Tom Tillis. Roy Cooper, just for a brief little history lesson, we saw in 2016 face off against the Republican incumbent, let me pull up the governor map, Pat McCrory in 2016, and narrowly defeated McCrory by 49.02% to McCrory's 48.8%, with the third party candidate getting 2.9% or 2.19%. I think the opportunity for Roy Cooper to do this again to another incumbent Republican in 2026 with Tom Tillis is certainly very possible. In 2020, again, Cooper got reelected by 4.5%. So Cooper's won two very, very close elections, not by blowout numbers or anything, but they're very, very close. But he's still a Democrat governor winning in the toss-up to, I would say, lean Republican state of North Carolina. The Senate side of things, Ted Bugg just won his election in 2022 by 3.2%. But Tom Tillis is a little bit more vulnerable. He won re-election in 2020 with 1.7% of the vote. His Democratic opponent, who did have a late-breaking scandal in the campaign, Cal Cunningham, got 46.94%. A third-party candidate got 3.13%, and another one got 1.24%. So Tillis was able to actually win here with some third-party support helping Tillis win. Back in 2014, Tillis defeated the incumbent Republican or Democratic Senator Kay Hagan by under 50% of the vote, with a third-party candidate getting 3% of the vote or so, almost 4%. The situation I'm setting up here is that Tom Tillis, there's a scenario he does not break 50% of the vote yet again. His two most recent elections that he's run for Senate, he has not broken even 49% of the vote. So if Roy Cooper, if there's no third-party candidate or there's only one third-party candidate, like a libertarian that takes votes away from Tillis, if Cooper can get around that 49% number again, Tillis gets around 48.8%. There could be a scenario here, coupled with Trump's approval number being at 45%, where Roy Cooper and the Democrats could narrowly flip North Carolina. And I will say this, Trump's approval rating being at 45% for 2026 is certainly, after the last few days, very, very possible if the economy does not recover. If the economy recovers for Trump and things are going good next year, maybe this doesn't happen, but at very least, it is a realistic possibility Trump's approval rating is at 45% or maybe even drops below that. If that is the case, I think North Carolina goes from being a very close toss-up that narrowly stays red to a very close toss-up that very well could elect the first Democratic senator from North Carolina since I believe Kay Hagan back in 2008. That's how much of a absolute critical position is both for the Senate map and for Trump's approval ratings and how the country is doing by 2026, because that could mean costing the Republicans a Senate seat in North Carolina and missing out on flipping a Senate seat in Georgia and Michigan and New Hampshire, and even maybe costing the only Republican Senate seat in a state won by Kamala Harris in 2024 and Susan Collins in Maine. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's obviously a hypothetical scenario, but I think it's a very interesting one that may potentially even happen in 2026, depending on how the next few months in next year go. So very interested to hear in the comments below what your thoughts are about this video. Make sure to give the video a like. Also, please remember to click subscribe as I post at least one new video every single day that you are not going to want to miss. All right, that'll do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.